close your eyes and drift back in time. It's the year 1386, and dawn breaks over a towering stone castle tucked deep in the English countryside. While lords and ladies still slumber beneath canopies of silk, a barefoot servant named Ellyn is already hard at work, stirring fires, fetching water, and quietly carrying the weight of an entire household on her small shoulders. Tonight, we'll walk in her simple shoes and discover the whispered rhythms of a medieval servant's day, from the chilly kitchens to secret castle passages, and the quiet dreams that follow. Now, take a breath and let's begin. The cold stones beneath Ellyn's feet were her first greeting of the day. Even before the rooster crowed in the castle yard, she was already awake, eyes fluttering open beneath a wool blanket that barely kept the chill at bay. The servants' quarters, tucked beneath the western stairs, were cramped and draughty, just enough space for 3 straw mattresses, a cracked wash basin, and a tiny window the size of a loaf of bread. She didn't need a bell to tell her it was time to rise. Her body knew. After all, it had been waking at this same hour every morning for the past 4 years. She sat up slowly, brushing straw from her coarse nightgown, and listened. The castle above was still quiet. No footfalls in the hall, no crackling hearths, no clatter of breakfast. But time was ticking. Fires had to be lit. Bread had to be baked. And if the mistress of the castle found the main hall cold when she rose, there would be scolding. Ellyn moved with practiced quiet. She gathered her apron, tied her cap, and slipped her feet into rough leather shoes that were more patched than sole. She didn't bother brushing her tangled brown hair. There was no one to impress in the scullery. In the corridor outside her room, the air was damp, scented with ash and old stone. A single candle burned low in the iron sconce, casting soft orange light that flickered across the grey walls. She paused, rubbed her eyes, and began her descent toward the kitchens. Her day's first duty. In the heart of the castle, the kitchen slept behind a heavy oak door bound in iron. It moaned open when Ellyn pushed, releasing a wave of air thick with grease and dried herbs. Here, among soot-stained walls and racks of wintered vegetables, she lit the first of many fires. Kneeling before the hearth, she struck flint to steel until a small flame sputtered to life. As the fire grew, it painted the dark space with a golden glow. Shadows danced across hanging ladles. Pewter plates and sacks of barley stacked in the corners. She filled a kettle with well water and set it to boil, knowing the steward would soon expect warm water for the Lord's shaving bowl. There was no time to waste. While the fire warmed, she climbed the servants' stair to the upper solar, where 2 more hearths waited cold and dark. Each one needed coaxing to life. Her fingers moved quickly, arranging dried kindling and blowing gently into the embers like she was waking a sleeping child. Outside the narrow arrow slit of a window, the sky was just beginning to lighten. Pale blue seeped into the dark, hinting at a misty morning beyond the castle walls. In the distance, the caw of a crow cut through the quiet, the only creature awake besides Ellyn. By the time the other servants began to stir, Ellyn had already kindled 4 fires, filled 2 buckets from the well, and laid out bread from yesterday's bake on the kitchen table. The mistress' linen gown and veil were already draped over a cedar chest in the ladies' solar, neatly pressed and sprinkled with lavender water, all before the rooster's first crow. She took a brief moment to sip from a cup of warm milk left from the night before. It was her only piece of the morning, standing alone in the kitchen's gentle warmth, hands curled around the clay cup, firelight flickering in her tired eyes. It was a humble life, repetitive, thankless, and silent. But it was also a rhythm she had come to understand deeply. Like the tick of a hidden clock, her tasks followed one another with steady familiarity. In just a few minutes, the castle would fully awaken. There would be barking dogs, bustling stewards, clanking armor, and shouting boys in training. But for now, in these fleeting minutes before the rooster crowed, Ellyn owned the castle. And then, like a small trumpet sounding from the stables, the rooster cried. Her moment was over. As the rooster's cry echoed across the courtyard, the castle began to stir. Ellyn placed her empty clay cup gently on the table and took one last breath of peace. That quiet moment, the warmth of the hearth and the hush of the early hour, was something she cherished more than she'd admit. But now came the rhythm of duty. Her soft footsteps echoed as she moved briskly from the kitchen to the hallway. The great hearth in the main hall needed feeding. Its fire would be the heart of the castle through the day, heating the room for meals, warming the backs of the lords and ladies, and drying damp cloaks hung near its edge. She paused before the massive stone fireplace. It stood taller than her by a head, framed with soot-blackened stones, and flanked by iron tools that hung like old soldiers. Cold ashes from the night before had settled into soft mounds at the base. Ellyn knelt and worked swiftly. She removed the old ash with practiced care, placing it into a clay bucket with a wooden scoop. Ash from the main hall's hearth was often scattered over the icy flagstones in the courtyard, a trick the steward taught her to keep boots from slipping in winter. Once the space was clean, she built a pyramid of dry kindling and small logs, nestled tight. With steady hands, she lit it from a smouldering coal she had kept alive in the kitchen hearth, shielded carefully under a bundle of moss. Soon, a soft flame flickered to life, growing and dancing as she added more wood. The hall began to glow. She didn't linger. There was a table to set. The long oak table in the center of the great hall was already partly laid out from the night before. Pewter cups, wooden trenchers, and a woven cloth runner stretched the length of it. Ellyn began wiping down the cups with a linen cloth, checking for spots, and resetting them with quiet precision. Behind her, the first signs of waking life echoed from the upper galleries. The scrape of shutters being opened, the soft creak of wood as chamber doors were unlatched, a low cough, then the hurried padding of small feet. The stable boy, likely, late again. Soon, others would descend. The steward with his ledger, the chamberlain with his keys, the cook with his orders. The hall would fill with murmuring voices and the clatter of preparation. But for a short while, Ellyn moved alone through the wide space, firelight dancing against the tapestry-covered walls, her tasks as quiet and purposeful as a prayer. From the kitchens, she could already smell the day beginning. The cook had arrived and stoked the second half. There would be barley porridge this morning, sweetened with a little honey if the stores allowed. She hoped for a slice of bread and cheese when her tasks were through. A clang at the gate startled her. The blacksmith's boy, likely delivering a newly sharpened blade, or perhaps a message from the nearby village. Ellyn paused for just a moment and turned toward the open window. Thin morning fog had rolled in, blurring the castle walls in white mist. From this height, she could see only silhouettes: a gardener bending over the herb beds, a scullery maid carrying a basin, 2 guards pacing the walk. The castle was waking fully now. Ellyn moved quickly toward the lower corridors. There were rushes to scatter in the lady's solar, dried reeds mixed with herbs like thyme and lavender, meant to mask odors and keep the space fresh. She liked this task. The scent of the herbs clung to her apron and reminded her of midsummer, even in the dead of winter. Her arms full of rushes, she climbed the narrow spiral staircase to the solar. Her soft footfalls echoed against the stone walls, each step cool beneath her shoes. In the solar, warm light filtered through stained glass, casting gentle patterns on the stone floor. Ellyn moved with care, laying the rushes across the ground in a neat layer. She paused to adjust the folds of the lady's gown once more, ensuring not a wrinkle marred the carefully pressed linen. And then, footsteps. Not hers. Heavier. Slower. Ellyn turned just in time to see the steward enter, ledger in hand, brows knit in his usual frown. He gave her a small nod, not quite warm, but not displeased either. That was as close to praise as one could expect from Master Ellis. "Ellyn," he said curtly, without lifting his eyes from the parchment, "once you're finished, help Greta with the winter linens. The South Tower rooms are to be readied." She curtsied and murmured, "Yes, Master Ellis." He left without another word, his boots tapping rhythmically against the flagstones. Ellyn waited a beat, then returned to her task. She'd be moving fast today. More fires, more stairs, more chambers to tend. But as she knelt once more to smooth the rushes, she smiled faintly. There was something comforting in the pattern of it all. Fires and footsteps, tasks and turns. The castle's heartbeat matched her own. Steady, familiar, constant, and the day was only just beginning. The narrow corridor smelled of soap and starch. Ellyn's hands were still warm from the rushes in the solar as she made her way toward the linen tower. It stood at the far edge of the inner ward, a squat spiral of stone stacked with floors of wooden shelves, woven baskets, and bundles of cloth. Few in the castle ever gave it much thought, but for servants like Ellyn, it was a world all its own. She passed through a creaky oak door and stepped into the base of the tower. The moment she entered, the air changed. Cooler, drier. It always smelled faintly of lavender, tucked into every bundle to ward off moths, and the faint trace of lye from washed sheets drying the day before. At the foot of the staircase, Greta was waiting. Greta was older, perhaps 30, and tall enough to bump her head on the lower arches if she wasn't careful. She wore a stiff apron with sleeves rolled to her elbows, revealing freckled arms and a no-nonsense posture. "You're late," she said without turning, already lifting a bundle of linens onto a shelf. "I was nearly through the second floor without you. I was in the solar," Ellyn replied, stepping forward to help. "Rushes and gown folds," Greta grunted. Not quite a complaint, not quite a prumplaint, not quite approval, and handed her a folded wool blanket. It was heavy and still slightly damp around the corners. Ellyn took it and carefully laid it on a low wooden rack to finish airing. Together, they worked in a quiet rhythm. Fold. Tack. Lift. Some cloth was so finely stitched it could only be used in the Lord's chamber. Others were patched and faded, meant for the guards or kitchen hands. Every piece told a story, of where, of seasons, of guests long gone. "Ellyn?" Greta said suddenly, breaking the quiet. You ever see the night shift? Ellyn blinked. You mean the sentries? Greta shook her head, eyes darting toward the spiral stairs above them. No, the linen shift, the whispering shift, up on the 3rd floor. Ellyn paused mid-fold. I've only ever gone up 2. Exactly, Greta lowered her voice. Nobody goes to the 3rd unless the steward tells them, but I've heard it. Late, on cold nights, whispers through the shelves, like voices tucked in the folds. Ellyn tried to smile, but her skin prickled. There's a story, Greta continued, her hands not stopping, about a serving girl long ago, worked in the linen tower just like us, caught stealing a silver goblet, said she hid it in a blanket, swore she'd give it back, but they locked her in overnight while they searched. Ellyn waited. They never found the goblet, Greta finished. But in the morning, she was gone, vanished. Doors still locked. Since then, some say you can hear her. The wind howled softly through a narrow slit of a window, as if on cue. Ellyn turned her gaze upward toward the dark spiral above. That's just an old tale. Maybe, Greta said. But I don't work past sundown, and I never go to the 3rd floor. You'll do fine to remember that. They fell silent again. Soon, the 2 women carried fresh linens in woven baskets to be placed in the south tower rooms, 1 floor up. No ghosts included. Ellyn's arms ached slightly from the weight, but the walk helped warm her again. The corridors were still quiet, echoing faintly with early footsteps and distant kitchen clatter. The south tower rooms were cold this time of year. With the shutters open, the wind pushed through the arrow slits and whispered along the walls. Ellyn laid a blanket on one bed, smoothing the corners, tucking the wool beneath the straw-stuffed mattress. She adjusted a faded curtain over the window to keep out the chill. Beside her, Greta sighed. Used to be guests slept in here. Knights, diplomats, once, even a bishop. Ellyn raised an eyebrow. What happened? Castle's quieter now. Fewer visits. Fewer reasons. It was true. Ellyn had never seen more than a handful of guests since she'd arrived. The war to the north had shifted travel patterns, and many lords now kept closer to their own keeps. There were still feasts and hunting parties, but the guest chambers rarely stayed full. As they moved to the next room, Ellyn glanced at a small carved chest near the fireplace. It was closed but slightly ajar. On instinct, she bent down and opened it fully. Inside, only linens, folded perfectly, but the faintest scent of lavender and something else. Not soap, not lye, something colder. She closed the lid gently and stepped back. You all right? Greta asked. Yes, Ellyn said quickly, just checking for moths. They finished the floor before the sun reached its highest point in the sky. By the time they returned to the linen tower, the firelight in the hall was blazing, and the kitchens were bustling with noise and warmth. Ellyn helped Greta restack the empty baskets and hung up her apron. She would be needed in the buttery next to check on the barrels and refill the jugs for the midday meal. The rhythm of the day was steady, comforting in its own way, but as she stepped away from the tower, Ellyn looked back once. The door to the 3rd floor was still shut tight, but she could have sworn, just for a second, she heard a soft rustle, as if someone or something was folding linens up there. By mid-morning, the warmth from the east-facing kitchens had crept along the stone corridors, and Ellyn welcomed it like a silent companion. After the cool shadows of the linen tower, The buttery felt almost cozy, though its thick, oak-scented air came not from warmth, but from barrels and stored bread. The buttery wasn't just where ale was kept. It was the belly of the castle's provisions, with narrow shelves lined with flasks, clay jugs, salted meats, wheels of hard cheese, and old casks sealed with wax and hope. Here, the castle's daily rhythm passed in whispers and footsteps. Ellyn ducked beneath a low beam as she entered. The room was dim but comfortable, a lantern flickering from a hook near the door. Hams hung from the ceiling. The scent of malt and herbs soaked into everything. She greeted the buttery master with a nod, an elderly man named Ellyn, who looked like he might have been sealed in one of the casks during the last rain. He muttered, through his thick white beard, eyes sharp despite his years. "You're late," he rasped. "I was with Greta." "Linens," Ellyn replied. "Of course," Ellyn said, unlocking the ale vault. "Linens wait. Ale doesn't. Fill those pitchers." She moved quickly, taking down a row of ceramic jugs from a shelf. They were heavy even before she filled them. Ellyn, though gruff, had a steady hand and helped lift one of the casks just enough to let the dark brown liquid trickle through the spout into her jug. The scent of barley and old wood filled her nose. "You know how to test it?" he asked, arching a white brow. "Of course," she said, tilting a tiny cup, letting the ale settle, and watching the foam. "Steady bubbles, not flat, not sour," he grunted in approval. "Not bad, girl. Most don't notice." She smiled slightly and filled the second jug. Ellyn wasn't cruel, but he didn't offer praise unless it was earned. That made it more valuable. As Ellyn worked, a rhythmic knock echoed from above. The kitchen crew signaling they needed the drink brought up. She balanced 2 pitchers carefully, bracing them against her hip as she walked the worn stone path back toward the great hall. The buttery sat beside the pantry and across from the kitchens, a perfect position for quick access, but also a place where gossip, arguments, and half-whispers often passed between barrels and bags of grain. It was there, just as she returned, that she caught a sound. Not the usual thump of kitchen feet, but something gentler. A hum, a soft old melody, just a few notes drifting from deeper within the buttery. Ellyn froze. Ellyn was in the front room, scraping mold off a wheel of cheese. No one else should have been down here. She set her jugs down quietly and stepped toward the sound. It came from near the back wall, behind the casks of dried fish and old wine bottles. She moved carefully, not wanting to knock anything over. The lantern light flickered faintly behind her, and then silence. The humming had stopped. She waited, held her breath. Nothing. She turned, slowly, to return to her task, but there it was again. This time, closer. The same 3 or 4 notes, old and familiar. A lullaby, maybe, or a drinking tune slowed into something more ghostly. "Ellyn?" She jumped. It was Ellyn, standing behind her. "You dropped those pitchers." "No," she breathed. "Just thought I heard." "Ah," he said with a knowing look. "You've heard her too." Ellyn blinked. "Who?" Ellyn nodded toward the deepest cask. "The lady of the barley." She stared. He leaned against the stone wall with a sigh. "Old story. They say there was once a girl who worked the buttery, sharp as you, quieter than most. Fell in love with a stable boy. Hid him down here when he was caught stealing bread. What happened to him? They say he ran, or Wynne said. Left her behind, and her voice, stuck in the walls, still sings sometimes, when barrels are low or hearts are heavy. Ellyn didn't know what to say. Wynne waved a hand. Or maybe it's just the wind through the cellar stones. Either way, don't let it keep you from your work. She nodded, lifting her jugs again, the weight now familiar. As she returned to the great hall, the bustling noise of preparation met her like a tide. Platters clanked, servants rushed, and the smell of roast meat filled the air. For a moment, the buttery felt far away, a quieter world tucked into the shadow of the castle's daily life. She handed off the jugs to the cupbearers, who poured ale into goblets for the midday meal. Laughter from the knight's table echoed through the hall. But even here, amid light and cheer, Ellyn couldn't quite forget the tune. Later, when she returned to the buttery, Wynne had already closed the vault and was brushing breadcrumbs from an old table. "Restock the barrels tomorrow," he said, not looking at her. Ellyn nodded, eyes flicking once more to the back of the room. The air was still, but she couldn't help herself. Softly, beneath her breath, barely above a whisper, she hummed the melody back. The same 3 notes. The barrel wood creaked in reply. The sun had crested the eastern towers, casting long shadows across the cobbled courtyard as Ellyn stepped into its morning light. After the cool hush of the buttery, the sudden brightness made her squint. The air buzzed with energy, not the solemn kind that echoed through the chapel or the stiff hush of the great hall, but the noisy, spirited kind that lived only in castle courtyards at peak bustle. Hooves clattered. Chickens flapped wildly from underfoot. Stable boys shouted over the sounds of clanging metal, barking dogs, and the crack of wooden practice swords. The heartbeat of the castle didn't come from its noble chambers. It pulsed right here, in the square of dust, sweat, and work between its walls. Ellyn pulled her shawl tighter and wove through the chaos with practiced grace. She held a small basket of cloth scraps and drying herbs to be delivered to the apothecary near the outer kitchen gate, but like many tasks in the castle, the delivery would take longer than expected. Just ahead, a wagon loaded with flour sacks had lost a wheel. The entire left side had buckled into the dirt, its bags now dangerously slumped toward the edge. 2 boys and a red-faced merchant yelled at each other, while a donkey stood blinking, entirely unbothered. "Mind your elbows," shouted a washerwoman, nearly bumping Ellyn with a wet sheet. She ducked just in time, barely missing a corner full of slop tossed from a bucket. To Ellyn, none of it was chaos. This was order in disguise, a symphony of duties happening all at once. Her feet moved automatically, weaving paths she'd memorized over years. Dodge the goat, pass behind the forge, avoid the patch of moss near the well that always stayed slick. She paused near the fountain to catch her breath. The central courtyard fountain wasn't ornate, just a thick stone basin where water bubbled from a lion's mouth carved into the wall. Servants filled jugs here. Dogs drank from it. Children dipped toes when no one was looking. The lion had lost 1 tooth and much of its dignity, but it still gurgled cheerfully. Ellyn knelt beside the fountain for a moment and washed her hands. The chill of the water spread through her fingers like morning dew. It was a quiet pocket in the middle of the storm. Then, a crash. She turned toward the west wall. The armory. 2 boys had dropped a crate of iron arrowheads, scattering them like stars across the cobblestones. A night squire cursed, rushing to collect them before the weapons master noticed. Ellyn sighed and walked over, kneeling beside them without a word. She scooped arrowheads into her apron folds while the boys scrambled. "Thanks, Ellyn," said one of them. Bran, a cook's nephew, his cheeks were red with panic. "You'll be quicker next time," she replied gently. The weapons master emerged from the doorway, scowling like a thundercloud. But when he saw Ellyn helping, his glare softened just enough for the boys to escape with their fingers intact. Once the last arrowhead was in place, Ellyn made her way across the courtyard to the apothecary door, tucked between the granary and the west tower stairwell. It was cooler inside. The smell of dried rosemary and vinegar filled the air. Shelves lined the walls, holding everything from nettle bundles to leeches in jars. "Delivery," called a voice. Mistress Salda, the castle's herbalist, appeared from behind a curtain. Her grey hair was tied back, her fingers already stained from morning tonics. "Yes, scraps and mint from Greta," Ellyn said, holding out the basket. Salda nodded, taking it with a tired smile. "Tell her I'll bring the salve by supper, and thank you, child." Ellyn turned to leave but hesitated. "Do you need help grinding root today?" she asked. Salda raised an eyebrow. "Volunteering, are you?" "I don't mind. It's quiet in here." The older woman studied her face, then motioned to a small stool. "Only for a moment," she said. "The root won't wait, and neither will the chickens." Ellyn smiled and sat. For 10 blessed minutes, the noise of the courtyard disappeared behind thick stone and rosemary-scented air. She ground the bitter root with rhythmic steadiness, the way Salda had taught her long ago. The apothecary always felt timeless, like stepping into a space older than the castle itself. Every jar and herb had a story, every potion a purpose. And in moments like this, Ellyn imagined a different kind of life, one where she learned the properties of bark and blossom, rather than hauling ale and scrubbing soot. But the courtyard always called back. Before the second bell rang, Ellyn thanked Salda, tied her apron, and stepped into the daylight once more. The rush had only grown. Prepare the entry, while servants lined up to bow. Ellyn watched from the edge, too low in station to greet, too curious to ignore. Inside the carriage, she glimpsed silks, gloved hands, and the cold glint of noble eyes. The castle paused, just for a heartbeat, as the guests stepped down, and then the rush began again. Ellyn didn't linger. She returned to her path, the sun now high, the work far from finished. But as she passed the mossy patch near the well, she smiled. The goat was asleep in the sun, and for a moment, amid the bustling clamour of castle life, the courtyard didn't feel rushed at all. It felt like home. By midday, the stone walls of the great hall began to breathe in a different rhythm. Gone was the clatter of morning chores and the bleating of livestock in the yard. In their place, silence, or something close to it. A dense, expectant quiet clung to the air, disturbed only by the occasional creak of a timber beam or the scurry of feet over flagstone. Ellyn stepped lightly, her soft-soled shoes muffling her steps as she entered the grand chamber. The sun streamed through narrow, stained glass windows high above, painting colored slashes across the wooden floor and catching motes of dust like tiny dancers. The hall was vast, colder than outside, and lined with long trestle tables. Above them hung faded tapestries, lions, serpents, and saints stitched into the weave of history. The air smelled faintly of beeswax, bread, and old smoke. This room, more than any other, bore the echoes of power. She wasn't supposed to be here yet, not until the table linens were needed, but she had been sent on a quiet errand. A noble lady, having lost a brooch in the earlier commotion, had asked one of the chambermaids to retrieve it discreetly. That chambermaid asked Ellyn, who, as always, said yes. The brooch, she was told, had likely fallen between the dais and the Lord's carved chair. Ellyn approached carefully. The raised platform at the end of the hall was polished smooth by generations of nobility. She bent low, heart steady, eyes scanning the edges. No brooch, just crumbs of feather and something sticky. She didn't dare investigate. As she crouched, voices floated in from the side alcove. She froze. Two men, speaking low, not whispering, but close to it. She didn't recognize one voice, but the other sounded like Master Aldrich, the steward who oversaw castle supplies and coin. "Too many mouths already," said one voice, "and the fall harvest may not come in time." "Don't say that aloud," Aldrich snapped. "There are ears everywhere." "I am saying it aloud. If the noble guests stay another fortnight, the cellar will run dry." Ellyn pressed herself behind the corner column. The men were near the wall tapestries, their backs to her. She had no intention of spying, but the acoustics of the hall made secrets hard to hide. A third voice joined them, higher, quicker. "Word is, the southern lords are on edge. If war brews again, this castle won't be left alone." The words sent a shiver down Ellyn's spine. War. The kind of talk usually reserved for torchlit conversations and locked rooms. "You worry too much," Aldrich muttered, though his tone had gone brittle. "Let the nobles deal with nobles. We keep the halls clean and the tables full. That's all that matters." "But what if—" "Enough." Ellyn didn't wait to hear more. She backed away on silent feet, ducking behind a bench and slipping back down the side hall. She didn't find the brooch, back in the brooch. Scullery. The world resumed its usual rhythm. Ellyn said nothing of what she heard. Servants were ears and hands, not mouths. Speaking of Lord's business could get one dismissed, or worse. Still, as she fetched the linen for the midday meal, her mind raced. Were the stores truly that low? Would noble guests eat while the children in the outer village starved? Would there be war? That afternoon, she returned to the great hall, this time with a team of girls, to help lay the tables. Each step was careful. Each fork and wooden cup placed just so. At the high table, closer to the lords, she worked with extra precision. Above her, the great stained glass window depicted Saint Oswin slaying a dragon. A story she didn't fully understand, though she admired the saint's calm face as he held his sword. As they worked, the nobles entered from the far door. Laughter. The soft jingle of rings and boots. Ellyn and the others kept their heads bowed. As richly dressed figures swept by, Lady Ismay, the noble who'd lost her brooch, paused briefly to look at Ellyn. "You, girl, did you find it?" "No, m'lady," Ellyn replied, curtsying low. "I searched the hall, but found nothing." The lady muttered, turning away. It was emerald and silver, likely stolen. Ellyn kept her eyes down. She knew better than to argue. Once the meal began, she retreated to the shadows of the pillar alcove, ready to assist should any cloth fall or a goblet spill. From her vantage point, she watched nobles eat and joke and whisper secrets between bites. She also watched Aldrich. He stood near the hearth, arms folded, his face unreadable. His eyes didn't linger on the feast. They watched the doors. Later that evening, after the guests retired, Ellyn helped clear the hall. Beneath the lord's chair, she checked again. Still no brooch, but this time she found something else. A slip of parchment, folded tightly. It was half-tucked under a floorboard near the platform's edge. She picked it up. No seal, no name. She didn't open it. She wouldn't dare. Instead, she turned and walked directly to Aldrich's chamber door near the lower corridor. She knocked once. He opened, eyes narrowing. Before he could speak, she held out the parchment. "I found it beneath the dais." A pause. A long one. Then he took it and nodded. "You've a careful eye," he said. Ellyn said nothing, just curtsied and turned away. As she walked back through the quiet halls, past echoing stone and flickering torchlight, she felt something had shifted. The whispers were growing, and somewhere between the tapestries and the dais, the castle itself was listening. The torchlight flickered low in the corridor, casting long shadows across the damp stone walls. Ellyn's breath fogged the air as she descended the narrow spiral staircase behind the buttery. This passage was rarely used, known mostly to stewards, cellars, and the oldest of servants. But tonight, she was tasked with delivering clean jugs to the lower storage, and Master Aldrich himself had told her which path to take. The chill deepened with every step. There was something about walking beneath the earth that made her heart beat a little louder in her ears. These walls had heard the footsteps of hundreds before her. Generations of hands had scraped these stones, patched these ceilings, whispered secrets through the echoing dark. The lowest cellar, known simply as the vault, lay at the base of the keep, a room carved into the bedrock, long before the upper floors were added. As Ellyn reached the bottom, the vault door stood slightly ajar. That vault door stood slightly ajar. Wasn't right. It was always kept locked, the key held by the steward or his assistant. No one ventured in without cause, and never alone. Still, her instructions were clear: deliver the jugs and return. With slow steps, she pushed the heavy oak door open, its iron hinges creaking in protest. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of old wood, dried herbs, and something else, faintly metallic. The torch bracket on the wall still held a smouldering flame, recently lit. Ellyn entered. The vault stretched wider than she remembered. The vault stretched wider than she remembered. Shelves lined the stone walls, filled with casks, pottery, sealed jars, and bundles wrapped in linen. Some shelves held extra linens and candles, while others contained ledgers and boxes sealed with wax. She moved to the far table and gently set down the clay jugs. As she did, she noticed an odd sound, the faintest scraping. Then a whisper. She froze. It wasn't the whisper of words. It was stone behind the stacked barrels in the corner. A panel in the wall shifted slightly. Dust fell in a lazy cascade. Her heart pounded. A secret door. It slid open just enough to reveal a sliver of torchlight beyond. Then, a figure stepped through. Ellyn ducked behind a barrel. The figure was cloaked, face hidden, but the build was unmistakably familiar. Tall, with the heavy gait of a man carrying purpose. In his hand was a small wooden case. He moved silently to one of the sealed crates near the wall and knelt. From his cloak, he pulled out a length of rope and tied something around the crate handle. A mark? A signal? Ellyn's mind raced. Was this part of the steward's secret errands? A noble smuggling items from the vault? A spy? The figure stood again, looked around the room, and then slid the stone panel back into place. He was gone. Silence returned. After a long moment, Ellyn stood, her legs trembling. Really, but something hidden was moving beneath the castle stones. The next morning, Ellyn reported nothing. Her lips remained sealed as she polished pewter plates in the scullery. Around her, the other servants gossiped about a visiting knight who drank too much mulled wine, or how the cook found weevils in the flour sack. Ordinary talk. Loud. Safe. But her thoughts lingered on the vault. Later that afternoon, Aldrich summoned her. She entered his chamber, eyes low, hands folded. He studied her a moment, then said, "You were in the vault last night." "Yes, master," she replied softly. "Anything unusual?" She paused. "Only that the torch was still lit when I arrived." His expression didn't change, but something in his eyes seemed to settle. "I see. You did as instructed. Good." He dismissed her without further word. As she walked back to the upper kitchens, she couldn't shake the feeling that her silence had bought her trust, or marked her for something more. That evening, a storm rolled in. Rain lashed the castle walls. Thunder cracked above the towers. Most servants stayed in their quarters or near the hearths, but Ellyn lingered near the old staircase, watching water snake across the stones. She thought of the secret door, the cloaked figure, the crate with the rope mark. What lay hidden beneath the castle? Gold? Secrets? Letters meant for distant kings. That night, as she lay on her straw-stuffed pallet in the servants' quarters, sleep came slowly. In her dreams, the castle breathed. Walls opened. Voices called her name from below, and somewhere in the dark, a secret waited, just beneath the stones. The heavy doors of the great hall stood open. From where Ellyn stood, in the shadows near the service alcove, she could see the grandeur of the castle's noblest space. High arched windows let in shafts of warm, late morning sunlight that danced upon the polished wooden table at the center. Banners hung down from the rafters like great sleeping birds, their colors dimmed by age but still proud. This was not her usual place. Servants of her standing rarely came this close to the Lord's dais, but today Mistress Enid had selected her and two others to assist in setting the midday table for a visiting noble. "Ellyn, keep your head down and your hands steady," Mistress Enid had warned, thrusting a folded napkin into her palm. "No staring, no speaking, no dropping anything." Ellyn had nodded, heart fluttering. She cleaned trenchers before, polished goblets and folded linens, but never had she walked in the room where the lord of the castle sat, where knights traded words over roast boar and scribes delivered news from distant lands, And now, she was part of the scene. As she stepped carefully forward, the scents wrapped around her like a tapestry. Rosemary from the roasted game, the tang of smoked eel, and the sweetness of honeyed plums. Platters were being arranged at exact angles, pewter goblets were set just so, and wine jugs placed with handles pointing inward. The air was charged, not just with the aromas of food, but with anticipation. The steward paced like a hawk watching his flock. "There is one less plum tart than expected," he growled, inspecting the plates. "If I find a missing one, someone's supper will be bread and brine." Ellyn kept her eyes low and hands busy, smoothing the cloth at the far end of the table. She moved like a shadow, unnoticed, unheard. But she could not stop her eyes from drifting upward for the briefest moment. There, at the head of the table, was the great chair, carved of dark oak with arms shaped like twin lions and a high back crowned with the family crest. It looked less like a seat and more like a throne. And there, not far from it, stood Lord Harwick himself. He was younger than Ellyn expected, not the wrinkled, grey-bearded man from the kitchen gossip, but strong and sharp-eyed, his shoulders wrapped in a deep crimson cloak. He was speaking to a man dressed in travelling leathers. The visitor, perhaps. Ellyn. Enid hissed under her breath. Snapping her back into place, she quickly returned her focus to the goblets, aligning them with practiced precision. More servants entered behind her, carrying silver covers for the dishes and warming stones for the bread basket. The visitor laughed at something Lord Harwick said, his voice deep and foreign. It echoed in the vaulted chamber like the low hum of a drum. From the corner of her eye, Ellyn caught sight of parchment being passed between the men, sealed with wax, then hidden beneath a napkin. She knew better than to wonder. Curiosity could be dangerous in a place like this. She turned to leave, her task complete. But as she passed behind the Lord's chair, her apron brushed the armrest, and something slipped from the fold and fell softly to the floor. A small silver fork. She knelt instantly, heart pounding. Her fingers reached for it, trembling, just as a pair of leather boots stepped into her view. She looked up, straight into the eyes of Lord Harwick. He said nothing. He merely looked at her, studying her as one might a strange coin, something out of place. Then, with a slight motion of his hand, he gestured for her to rise. She stood, eyes lowered, offering the fork with both hands. He took it. "Thank you, girl," he said. His voice was calm, measured, but it carried the weight of a man used to being obeyed. She bowed quickly and turned away. Mistress Enid was already near the door, her face pale with dread. As soon as Ellyn stepped through the arch, the woman whispered fiercely, "What were you thinking?" "I dropped a fork," Ellyn replied, breathless. You looked at him. You spoke. "Do you want to be reassigned to chamber pots?" Ellyn nodded her apology. No excuses, but deep. Inside, as she returned to the kitchen with the others, something stirred. Not fear, exactly, but awe. She had seen the Lord of Harwick's eyes, and he had spoken to her, gently. That night, by the servant hearth, as the others grumbled about blistered feet and bad stew, Ellyn kept quiet. She replayed that moment again and again. The glint of the great hall's sunlight, the thunderous silence of standing in its center, and the weight of being seen. Just for a breath of time, she had glimpsed a world far above her own, and now something inside her had shifted. By the time the sun began to dip below the treetops, the castle had changed. Gone was the noise of the courtyard, the clang of metal, the bark of orders, the rumble of carts. In its place came the hush, the soft winding down of a long day. Shadows stretched across stone walls like blankets being pulled over the world. Lamps were lit with slow care. Torches flared in quiet alcoves, their flickering glow casting dancing silhouettes along the walls. Ellyn stood by the narrow window in the scullery, catching her breath. She had scrubbed the serving trenchers, carried off greasy linens, swept ash from the hearth, and delivered basin water to the laundress. Her hands were wrinkled and raw from soap root. Her back ached, and her feet throbbed inside her worn leather shoes. But now there was stillness. Even the wind through the arrow slits sounded gentler at dusk, a soft hum, like a lullaby played by the stones themselves. It was the hour when the castle seemed to sigh. She stepped outside into the lower courtyard, where the fading light painted the walls a warm amber. The sky was streaked with orange and lavender, and the top of the chapel tower caught the last of the sun's rays like a candle on a tall stand. Few people lingered now. Most servants were in the kitchens, finishing supper or preparing for their own simple meal. Ellyn took a moment, just a small one, to lean against the cool stone of the wall and breathe. Across the yard, she saw Tom, the stable lad, leading a tired horse toward the stables. Its hooves clicked softly against the stone. He gave her a quick wave, which she returned with a small smile. Even at the end of a long day, Tom found a way to grin. Ellyn admired that. Farther along the castle walk, she could hear the chapel bell ringing once, not loud, but enough to mark the hour. The priest would soon be locking the doors and tucking away the candlelight. Evening prayers would follow. Prayers would follow. The upper halls, noble folk would gather around their hearths, sipping mulled wine, retelling the day's gossip and news. But down here, the servants' world was slower, quieter. She made her way to the kitchen steps, where Mistress Enid was passing out bowls of stew and heel ends of bread. The food was simple, but after a day like this, even turnip stew could taste like royal fare. Ellyn sat on the edge of a worn bench, spoon in hand, eyes still drifting to the tower above. There was something about dusk that made the castle feel ancient, not in a frightening way, but like the stones were whispering old secrets, about knights who once rode out to war, about queens who walked these halls in velvet, about feasts and betrayals, love and prayers, snowstorms and spring fairs. You couldn't hear these stories during the chaos of day. Only at dusk did the castle speak. As she finished her stew, she noticed a candle being lit near the armory door. Old Rafe, the gatekeeper, was starting his rounds early. His dog padded behind him, tail wagging low. A raven circled the battlements overhead, cawing once before disappearing into the trees. Ellyn stood and returned her bowl to the washing barrel, then climbed the servants' steps to the upper corridor. Her next duty was small, to light the taper candles along the inner passageway before full dark. She struck flint to tinder and walked slowly, lighting each candle with care. With each flame that caught, the shadows retreated a little. The stone hall warmed, just a bit, in the soft golden glow. When she reached the end of the hall, she paused at the arrow loop again, looking out one last time. The village beyond the walls was quiet too. Tiny hearth fires dotted the dusk like stars on the ground. She could see a fisherman pulling in his nets by the river. A dog barked once, distant and faint. The castle may have been grand, but outside there was another world. One day, perhaps, she might live in it. But for now, this was her place. She turned from the window, her candle nearly spent. Her final task was to fold the night linens and place them in the steward's chest. As she passed the tapestry in the corridor, the one with the embroidered stag in the glade, she thought she saw it shift in the candlelight. Just a trick of shadows, perhaps. Or maybe, as she sometimes liked to believe, the castle was very gently alive. Back in the scullery, she placed the folded linens neatly into the chest, closed the lid, and sat down by the hearth. Tomorrow would come early, as it always did. But for now, in the hush of the castle at dusk, Ellyn let herself drift. The crackling fire beside her whispered quiet comfort. Outside, the stars were beginning to claim the sky. Inside, the castle exhaled, and in that moment of stillness, the servant girl who had spent the day running and scrubbing and bowing felt something rare. Peace. The castle was still, not just quiet, still in the way a pond rests when the wind forgets to blow. Not a clatter, not a voice, not even the creak of old hinges. Every sound, even the softest ones, felt like they were tucked under a blanket. Midnight was close. Ellyn moved carefully through the lower halls, her footsteps muffled by the rush matting laid down for winter. In her hands, she held a small lantern, its flame barely more than a flicker, just enough to light her way. Most of the castle slept now. The nobles in their chambers, wrapped in silks and feather-stuffed bedding. The steward in his quarters, ledger closed for the night. The children, pages, even the guards not on duty, all cradled by the deep lull of darkness. This was the time no one saw, when the castle's heart beat slowest. But Ellyn was still awake. Her final duty of the day was simple, yet sacred, to stoke the embers in the great hall's hearth before midnight, so the room would not go cold before dawn. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't loud, but it mattered. She stepped softly through the arched doorway into the vast hall. It felt like entering a cathedral. Vaulted ceilings, long shadows, the glow of a single dying fire in the great stone hearth. The high tables were empty now. The chairs, grand and carved with family crests, were pushed back neatly. The rushes on the floor had been swept clean. Silver goblets sparkled faintly on the sideboard in the firelight. It was hard to believe how loud it had been here just hours ago. Laughter, the clatter of knives, music, dogs barking at dropped bones. But now, all that remained was ash and memory. She knelt before the hearth, using a long iron poker to rearrange the glowing coals. They hissed and crackled softly, like they too were whispering themselves to sleep. She added 2 pieces of dry wood from the stack and sat back on her heels, watching as the flame caught and curled upward. Warmth spread slowly. Not much, just enough to keep the cold from creeping in through the stone. She didn't move for a while, just sat there, watching the fire. This was her favorite time. There were no commands, no chores, no rush. Just the firelight, the silence, and her own thoughts, rare as gold in a servant's day. Somewhere above, on the highest floor of the castle, a night breeze stirred a wooden shutter. It knocked faintly, tap-tap, against the tower wall. Far below, the river murmured softly as it flowed beneath the bridge. Ellyn let her eyes close for a moment. What did the nobles dream of, she wondered? Battles? Jewels? Did they dream at all? She dreamed of meadows sometimes, open fields, where she could walk without a tray in her hands, or dreams of riding a horse across the hills, wind in her hair like she had no duty calling her back. Once, she even dreamed she lived in a small cottage with ivy around the door and her own fire to tend. Not that she expected it, but in the silence before midnight, it felt safe to wonder. She stood slowly, stretching her arms. The fire was strong now. Her job was done. She turned, walking quietly across the hall toward the narrow servant's door tucked behind a tapestry. It was dark in the corridor beyond, but her lantern cast just enough light to guide her steps. On her way to the cellar stairs, she paused at the chapel window. Even in darkness, the stained glass glimmered faintly, moonlight catching bits of red and blue like a secret prayer. She made the sign of the cross without thinking. It wasn't about piety, it was habit, a rhythm, like turning down a bed or brushing crumbs from a table. At the bottom of the stairs, she passed the storeroom and the old wine racks, now mostly empty. The air was cool and damp, smelling faintly of earth and wax. A small wooden cot waited in the corner behind a low partition wall. Her bed. Ellyn set the lantern on the floor and pulled the wool blanket up over her shoulders. She lay back with a quiet sigh. No feather mattress, no silk coverlet, but it was hers. Above, the castle dreamed of kings and keepers, of whispered secrets in halls, of bannermen and ballads. And down below, in the silence before midnight, one servant girl finally let her eyelids fall. The fire above still burned. The stars outside still turned. The stone walls held their silence, and the castle slept on. The castle slept on.